Hey my good friends, Sam Haymart with Test Driven TV. Today we're out here having some fun with the Subaru Solterra EV SUV. So obviously we've been driving it. I'm going to show it to you inside now. We're going to take it out for a little spin and then I'm going to tell you what I really think. All right, my friends, so let's talk about what we've got here. As you can see, we've been out here playing in the mud with this thing just a little bit. Proof positive, you can get these things dirty. Just because you plug it in doesn't mean it can't get wet. This is a fully loaded 2024 Solterra Touring with the options that this has. This one's pricing out at $54,000 and some change. Pretty spendy. This is the most that you can spend on the Solterra. It's got optional color, a few little things inside and out, the two-tone paint being one of them. So just in case you didn't know, the Subaru Solterra is virtually identical to the Toyota BZ4X. Very similar to how they did with the Toyota GT86 and Subaru BRZ sports cars. They're the same car, new badges, a couple little trim treatments, otherwise they're virtually identical. The big difference with the Solterra is that it comes standard with all-wheel drive. Subaru calls it symmetrical all-wheel drive. That is a marketing term. It's all-wheel drive, but there are a few X-mode items and things like that that make it a little bit different. We'll talk about that when we get out on the drive. Styling-wise, it is virtually identical, but there are a few little key differences and trims here and there. On the front, you can definitely tell that this is an EV. It doesn't have a big grille. It's got a nice black applique on the hood that really gives it a lot of set off. It really ties in with the black plastic cladding that is ever present at all four corners of this car. This does have, of course, LED headlights, and because we are in the top trim grade, this has 20-inch wheels down here, which really aren't my best choice for off-roading, so we're not really going to go rock crawling today. Up on the roof, this does have roof rails standard, which is kind of an SUV touch. This also has a panoramic glass roof. It is a fixed glass roof, but a full glass roof it is. I have to say, I think the rear three-quarter view on this is pretty sexy, especially all dressed up with some mud and dirt like this. It just looks like adventure, doesn't it? And I would say that in the black and white with the two-tone roof and the two-tone paint treatment that this has, they even gave us a black and white license plate back there. It just, the whole thing is like it was meant to be in terms of the look. The taillights on this, LED, of course. They have some pretty controversial design elements. I've heard some commentary. Some people like these, some people don't. I think they work well with the design and with a lot of the little details back there, the way that spoiler works. And it definitely shows that they put some thought into how they designed this vehicle. This is, of course, a power opening hatch. You'd expect that at this price, and it works pretty well. And, well, that gets us to the interior, doesn't it? In the confines of this nice warm dry space, the first thing I would show you is just look at the design of this. It's very appealing, very future forward. This really is a nice welcome space for the eyes. They've got a number of different finishes. The cloth on the dash has a nice sort of waffle cloth sort of feature that gives it an earthiness in here. The instrument cluster in the driver cockpit looks very futuristic. And then look at the seats. They've actually given us a gray and sort of slate blue combination on the trim, which I think is very handsome. They look very nice. And the quality materials in here is of a pretty good level. It is fitting of its price tag. So let's talk about what it's like to live with. First of all, these seats are quite comfortable. They are vinyl. We're at $54,000 and we're sitting in vinyl seats, not leather, but it is an EV, and car makers tend to sort of, skew towards people that are, maybe a little more conscious of things like leather and sustainable materials and so forth. Nonetheless, they're vinyl. They are heated and ventilated up front. They are heated in the rear. I find that for my driver's seat, it's relatively comfortable. I do have memory settings over here, and the passenger does have power adjustments as well. Now, as I sit here, we've got to talk about this cockpit because the steering wheel was redesigned for 2024. It's sort of a square squircle design. As you can see, it looks quite sporting and looks quite modern. The reason for that is because this flat top is almost necessary for you to see the instrument cluster, because most cars, you look through the steering wheel to see your instrument cluster. This one, you're actually looking over the top of the steering wheel to see it. And the instrument cluster is set out way ahead of you. Now, that instrument cluster, for being as far away from the driver as it is, I think is a little bit on the small side. It really could be quite a bit larger. To be seen a little bit easier, and because of the way it's designed, it does tend to be in the sunlight at certain points of the day. A little bit of glare there. Paddle shifters on the steering wheel for adjusting the regenerative braking. There's also a button down here on the center console that allows you to go straight for the strongest setting, which gives you the one pedal drive, and that's pretty cool in an electric car. You can let off the power pedal and it will bring it to a stop, or a very quick regenerative braking slowdown. And so you can go all the way to the highest setting that you tap, 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 tap on these paddle shifters to get to just by pressing a button. Drive modes are over here on the center console, the X mode, and we'll talk about those when we get out on the drive. Drive modes, all the other selections here, the gear selector in the center, it is a knob. Not my favorite, but in a car like this, I think it is fitting. Center stack on this one has the largest 12.3-inch infotainment display, which we'll talk about separately just below that. A few hard controls for that, volume, power, and then HVAC controls and seat controls below that. Now, here is a spot for your phone. It's got a wireless charger. It opens up and the phone is inside. It is kind of a cool design. It lets you conceal that phone away, and maybe you want that. I tend to like to be able to see my phone at all times, so if it lights up with some kind of a notification, I can see it. I can just take a quick glance or maybe pick it up or whatever. I don't like them hidden away or under a cover. The other thing that's kind of weird about this, if you do leave it open, is that this door sort of gives you an odd place to rest your wrist. The design of it just doesn't seem to be really well thought out, in my opinion. I like the fact that it's got an opening and closing compartment, but I just think there's a better way they could have done this. Further back behind this, cup holders. And then in here is the center console storage. Now there's a tray that sits in here that gives you about the size of 1.5 square tissue boxes of storage. This tray then lifts out, and down below there's a deep well. In this case, the owner's manual is down there. And the reason that is there is because there's no glove box on this car. And that is a big omission, in my opinion, in the living with it every day sort of design, because this is an electric car. There's absolutely no reason, with all of the packaging that could have been done here from a ground up design, there's absolutely no excuse for that. There's no reason they could not have put a glove box there. Yes, there is a place to put the owner's manual, but it'd be nice to have this and that. The other thing is, this little plastic bin in here rattles to hell and back. I've had to stuff things in there to keep it from rattling as I drive around, and being a Type A, that just won't do. The good news is there is other storage in here. There's a little space down here below the console, which is a bit of a hollow space. You can put a backpack or a purse. There's also ports down there, power ports, charging ports, etc. Above me is the panoramic roof we talked about on the outside, and it is a fixed glass panel. It does not have an opening section, but it does have a nice opaque cover that you can close. I like it open, especially on a day like this. It just really makes it airy in here. The back seat of the Solterra, the first thing that struck me when I sat back here is the fact that I have a very unnaturally low seating position for a crossover SUV. As you can see, my knees are perched way up. I'm sitting kind of like I'm down in a scrunched position, and that's because the seating position relative to the floor is very car and sedan-like. One of the reasons for that is because we've got a big battery under the floor. They've had to raise the floor up to accomplish that. And I really think that's what's at work here. But beyond that, there is plenty of knee room and leg room back here. These seats are set for my height, about 5'9" with my boots on. I've got about 4 or 5 inches ahead of me. And the headroom is pretty good, even with a little bit taken out because of this opening shade and the sunroof that's above me. These seats are somewhat flat, not the most comfortable, in addition to the fact that the low seating positions here. I wouldn't mind sitting back here for a while, but a long road trip would probably get me ready to get out of here. Amenities back here, not too bad. As I mentioned, we do have heated seats back here. The controls there on the back of the center console, along with charging ports, and down below, vents. One of my hot buttons here, living in the desert where it gets well over 100 In the summer, I like to have air vents in the back seat of a car. Now, looking at the rear cargo area, you can see that these seats do fold down in a 60-40 split to give you an almost flat load floor. And I like the fact that they've given us lots of space back there. They've also optioned on this car nice big rubber mat, which I think is totally cool. I love that in a vehicle, especially on a day like today. We've been out here in the mud. I've been in and out of this vehicle with my gear. You can just throw it in there without worrying about getting carpet dirty. They also option these mats on the floor back here as well as in the front. In the front, you can see they look a little bit lived in today. It's because I've been getting in and out of this thing on a rainy, muddy day. So I think that is a must-have option if you're actually going to live in this thing like a real SUV. So in the final analysis, this is an interior that at first blush has a beautiful design to look at. It's very futuristic. It's got a lot of tech features in here. Feature content, quality is good. There are some design elements though that we talked about that I think are sort of future forward for future forward's sake. This relationship of the instrument cluster and the steering wheel being one of them. They've had to design this in a way that's a little bit different just so that it would work. The omission of a glove box is another weird thing. So while it looks cool, living with it every day is compromised in a few spaces. This interior gets 4 out of 5 stars. The infotainment system here, because we are in a Toyota-based vehicle, is a Toyota-based infotainment system. Very much the same system we're going to find in almost any Toyota vehicle of late. It is a cloud-connected system in which most of its feature content depends on the cloud. It also depends on a subscription. So navigation, for instance, we don't have nav here because the subscription is not enabled. It has AM, FM, Sirius XM, Bluetooth connectivity, of course, wireless Apple CarPlay, wireless Android Auto, and as you dig through the menus, you can also access some of the settings for the car and other things, but not as many as you'd think. A lot of the settings are still in the instrument cluster. You have to thumb through things here on the steering wheel to get into them. Not very many things are actually in the easier to use touchscreen menus, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. My biggest thing is that most of the features that make this a really exciting system require a subscription. Don't like that as a customer that just spent $54,000 for my car. Kind of a turnoff, in my opinion. On the upside, this does have the Harman Kardon audio system, which has a very good sound, even with satellite radio, and a 360-degree view camera, which works quite well. As you can see, the graphics are good. When you turn the steering wheel, the little lines turn so you can see where your wheels are going. Very helpful for parallel parking so you don't curve your wheels. But at the end of the day, while this is a good system, graphics, menu, getting around is good, sound is good, I think it's missing a few features for this price range, especially given that you have to pay a subscription to get most of them. This system gets 4 out of 5 stars. All right, my friends, it's raining today, and so we're either going to drive in the rain or we're not going to have a shoot. So we're driving in the rain. So the question I always like to ask right when we start our test drive is, how does it go? So I'm going to come to a complete stop and go. Ooh, nice little rush there. And 60. So power, I would say, is medium. This isn't a high-performance electric, but it certainly isn't slow. With all-wheel drive standard, it has a motor in the front and a motor in the back, and it has a total of 215 horsepower, 249 pound-feet of torque between the two and the battery. So horsepower here is not exactly the most you're going to find in the class. In fact, it is on the low end, and torque specifically is on the low end. And while the motors themselves might very well be capable of producing more, the tuning, the battery, the overall electrical architecture and how it's put together and designed are what gives you those outcomes. So this is a car that was deliberately designed not to be the most powerful that you can get out there. They really wanted to go a little bit more toward efficiency, and to that end, range on this, according to the EPA, is 222 miles. Again, on the lower end of the spectrum for vehicles in this price range and size range in the EV realm. Efficiency, 102 mpge according to the EPA. And for me, in my days with it this week, that has equated to about 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour. So if you take the kilowatt hours that the battery has and you sort of figure in how many miles you're getting out of that, that's where that's at. It's kind of hocus pocus, it's kind of smoke and mirrors, but it really is just simple math in most cases. Now, the truth of the matter is that in my week with it, I have not found this car to be nearly as efficient as it is portrayed to be. Okay, so 222 miles is the range. I've charged it twice, and when it's full, about 200 miles range is what it shows me according to the drive history here. It figures out, you know, basically how the car's been driven and what your range is going to be. If you crank on all of the electric stuff, that range drops. And just like today, I started out with not quite 200 miles range on it. I drove 50 miles and a lot more than that came off the range. So it uses power at a faster rate than what the electronics portray to you. So if you're taking this on a long trip, you have to be very careful not to go, well, I can go 200 miles. Not really, at least based on my driving with this, it uses up that power a lot faster than you're actually driving miles. So that range drops faster than the actual miles driven, if that makes sense. So efficiency and power, not exactly class leading here. Refinement's good, and the overall driving experience is good. And the drivetrain does have a number of drive modes tied to mud and snow and things like that, which we'll get to here in a minute. But in terms of efficiency, power, and power delivery, refinement, I find that this is a powertrain that, while it is pleasant to drive, it is not very competitive compared to all of the other things you can buy in this class. This powertrain gets 3 out of 5 stars. Now to ride, drive, and handling. Electric cars are always a question mark when it comes to chassis dynamics, how they handle, how they drive, because they are so heavy. This one weighs right around 4,500 pounds, which isn't really super duper heavy, not compared to some of the electrics I drive, which range between 5,000 and 6,000 pounds. This is a car that is on the lighter end of the spectrum. However, because it is heavy, it's the big battery that's underneath the floor, the suspension has to be tuned quite stiff on an electric car in general. Some of the more premium ones I drive have adaptive suspensions with air springs, or perhaps just adaptive dampers that allow the tuning to be variable, so that when you're driving around town and you hit bumps and speed bumps, manhole covers, anything that would be rough, it allows it some compliance, but tends to be stiff when you need it. This is a car that has fixed spring rates, it has fixed damper rates, so the tuning is very important. How did they tune it? Is it comfortable? Is it too stiff? Is it stiff enough? And what I've been finding is that the suspension here is relatively stiff. It can be a little bit jarring around town going over things like speed bumps. If you hit potholes, things like that, you feel them, especially with these larger wheels and low profile tires that this particular one has. Out on the highway, it's relatively quiet. On our 70 mile an hour decibel test, it came out at 60.3, which is just below the average point, which is about 61. So not the quietest, but certainly not the noisiest. Feels very stable on the highway. Steering has a good feel, and because it is heavy, it feels like a good solid car. But we are in a Subaru after all, with standard symmetrical all-wheel drive. I want to find out what this feels like off the pavement. Woo! All right. Well, out here on my favorite desert washboard road, oop, here's a big puddle. Woo! Well, this is fun today because it's raining and it's wet, and it's actually the funnest time to bring a vehicle out here to this road, because you can get really slippy, slidey out here on these corners. So this wouldn't be a test drive of an SUV on Test Driven TV if I didn't bring an SUV out here to the desert washboard road. And just because it's electric doesn't give it an automatic pass to stay on the pavement. This is a Subaru after all. It's got all-wheel drive, 8.3 inches of ground clearance, X modes, snow, mud, sand, the works. It's got various modes you can set. Now, I don't have anything set here because it just really isn't necessary. We're on a pretty manicured road. It's just a little bit wet and muddy, and we're not getting off on the trails because honestly, this has got street tires on it for the most part that I'm just not real confident, and I'm out of cell phone range. So, woo! Here's another one. Here it is. Woo! Oh, I love that. Yeah, so we're not going off on the trail today, but this is a good way of testing this car to see how well bolted together it is, how well it does handle slippery surfaces, and you know, how well put together this chassis is, because this desert washboard road has a way of making even the best, most expensive, well put together SUVs feel like a complete POS. Trust me, you'd be surprised. So what I'm finding out here is that while we just talked about on the pavement that this has a bit of an unforgiving ride over some of the road irregularities around town, I am quite surprised that out here, in spite of not having an adaptive suspension, this is quite comfortable and well sorted out here on this rougher road. This is what you would buy a Subaru for and get your money's worth. It feels solid, it feels well put together in the structure, and the overall ride just isn't that jarring, and I honestly expected it to be because of what I experienced in town. So it is a stiffly sprung car. It does have fixed dampers and spring rates, but they seem to have found the magic medium to where it's not too rough, it's not too soft. I haven't bottomed out on any of these washes or any of these ruts, and that does happen in an SUV sometimes. And while I've got my camera out there on the side of the car capturing what we're driving through, it's probably covered with mud and water now, and you really can't see much. And here comes another puddle. Whee! I love that. All right, my friends, I'm going to try to wrap this up expeditiously in our conversation about value. It's freezing out here, even though I'm in Arizona. It's still a pretty cold day, and it's windy, and there's a big front of rain right over there on its way here. It's going to be here any minute. So let's talk about value. $54,000 and some change for a fully loaded Solterra EV. This does start out down in the 40s. And this is eligible in some cases for the $7,500 tax incentive. So I think my big takeaway here is the fact that the powertrain and the range isn't quite up to snuff for this price range. I think generally speaking, when you're spending around $55,000 and you look at what else you could buy out there in the EV field, most other cars at that price offer quite a bit more range, and in most cases more horsepower. So that was one area where Toyota and Subaru didn't quite get their chips in the right place, I don't think. Now chassis, obviously, it was more impressive than I expected it to be for a non-variable suspension. It did pretty well out here in the mud, and as you can see, we had a good time with it. Warranty coverage, 3 years, 36,000 miles bumper to bumper, 5 years, 60,000 miles powertrain, and 8 years, 100,000 miles for the battery and electrics. That's class average, not the best in the business. Overall though, I think value here, I'm going to put it 4 out of 5 stars. When you put that in with everything we've already talked about, we're at 4 out of 5 stars for the review. So there you go, this Subaru Solterra in the mud, no less. So if you like what we do, you can see our latest video right there. Better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel right down there. Either way, stay tuned. Brr.